every April, on the same quiet morning, before the church bells rang, before the bakery opened, before children walked to school. An old pickup truck slowly rolled down Willow Road. Behind the wheel sat 85-year-old Samuel Brooks. The truck wasn't new. Its green paint had faded decades earlier. The passenger seat held only three things: a shovel, a small bucket of water, and a young oak sapling. Every year, without fail, Samuel planted exactly one oak tree. Never two, never three, always one. The people of Cedar Creek had watched this routine for nearly half a century. Some smiled, some waved, some wondered, but no one truly understood. "Happy birthday, Sam," the owner of the town bakery called as Samuel drove past. Samuel tipped his old cap. "Thank you." Off to plant another one. "As always." The baker laughed. "You'll turn the whole county into a forest." Samuel smiled. That wouldn't be such a bad thing. The children riding bicycles often followed him. They loved watching the old man dig. He never seemed to hurry. Every movement was careful, almost respectful, as though he wasn't planting a tree. He was introducing a new friend to the earth. After covering the roots with soil, Samuel always rested one weathered hand on the tiny trunk, then quietly whispered something no one could hear. Every year, the same words, no one ever asked. Some moments, people instinctively knew were private. Over 45 years, the little oak trees had grown into towering giants. Their branches shaded playgrounds, protected walking trails, sheltered birds, and cooled the streets during long summer afternoons. Children climbed them. Couples carved initials into them. Grandparents rested beneath them. Few people realized every one of those trees had been planted by the same pair of hands. Samuel never accepted praise. Whenever someone thanked him, he simply smiled. The trees deserved the credit. His little farmhouse sat at the edge of town. Simple, white, with a weathered front porch. Beside it, a workshop filled with gardening tools, shelves lined with flower seeds, clay pots, and dozens of notebooks, each carefully labeled by year: 1982. 45 notebooks, one for every tree. Inside each notebook, Samuel had written only a few pages: the date, the location, the weather, the height of the sapling, and one final sentence, always different, always beginning with the same three words: for whoever. No one else had ever read them. His nearest neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Parker, often watched him from across the fence. One afternoon, she finally laughed. "You know, Sam, if people didn't know better, they'd think you loved trees more than people." Samuel smiled gently. "I love people." He looked toward the young oak growing beside the road. "That's exactly why I plant trees." Evelyn frowned slightly. She wanted to ask what he meant, but Samuel had already changed the subject. "Your tomatoes look healthy this year." She smiled. "You always know how to escape a question." Samuel laughed. "Only the difficult ones." The following Saturday, several children were playing beneath one of Samuel's oldest oak trees. Its branches stretched nearly 70 feet across the park. The afternoon sun filtered gently through thousands of green leaves. Parents relaxed on nearby benches. Teenagers read books in the shade. A little girl looked up toward the enormous trunk, then asked her grandfather, "Who planted this tree?" The old man shrugged. "I don't know. It's probably always been here." Samuel happened to hear the conversation. He smiled quietly. Sometimes, the greatest gifts become so ordinary, people forget someone once chose to give them. That evening, Samuel celebrated his birthday alone, just as he had for many years. He wasn't lonely. He simply enjoyed peaceful evenings. He grilled a small steak, watered his roses, then sat on the porch watching the sunset. As darkness settled across Cedar Creek, he opened the newest notebook, carefully wrote today's date, then added, "For whoever needs shade on a summer afternoon I will never see." He closed the notebook, placed it beside the other 44, and turned off the lamp. The next Monday, a new family moved into the old Carter house. Among them, a curious 10-year-old boy named Ben. Unlike most children, Ben asked questions about everything. Why old buildings leaned, why rivers curved, why birds returned every spring, and why one elderly man kept planting trees, year after year. 3 days later, Ben spotted Samuel loading another shovel into his truck. He rode his bicycle across the street. "Excuse me, Mr. Brooks." Samuel looked up and smiled. "Good morning." Ben glanced toward the tiny oak sapling resting in the truck bed. "I've been wondering something." Samuel leaned against the truck. Ben pointed toward the small tree. "Why do you keep planting oak trees?" Samuel smiled. "They're strong. They live a long time." Ben nodded. "But," he hesitated, "you probably won't live long enough to sit under this one." The morning suddenly grew very still. Samuel looked at the young sapling, then at the boy standing before him. A slow smile spread across his face. Not because the question surprised him, because he had been waiting 45 years for someone to finally ask it. He gently closed the truck door, pulled a second shovel from the back, then looked at Ben. "Would you like to help me plant this one?" Ben's eyes widened. "Really?" Samuel nodded. "Less. But if we're going to plant it together, I think it's finally time for someone to hear the story." The morning air was cool. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh earth across the open field. Samuel handed the second shovel to Ben. The boy gripped it with both hands. It felt heavier than he expected. Samuel smiled. Planting a tree should take a little effort. Otherwise, would forget how valuable it is. Together, they dug quietly. The soil was soft from spring rain. Birds sang from nearby branches. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Samuel believed some stories deserved to begin slowly. When the hole was finally deep enough, Samuel carefully lowered the tiny oak into the ground. Ben steadied the thin trunk with both hands. Its roots disappeared beneath the fresh soil. So small, so fragile. Almost impossible to imagine that one day it could become a giant. Ben looked at the sapling, then back at Samuel. "So, you've really planted one every year?" Samuel nodded. "Since I was 40. Ben counted quietly. "That's 45 trees." Samuel smiled. 46 now." Ben laughed. "Most people buy themselves birthday presents." Samuel brushed dirt from his gloves. "I suppose this is mine." The boy hesitated, then asked the question again. "But why?" Samuel looked toward the distant hills. His smile slowly faded, not into sadness, into memory. "It happened when I was 22, he said softly. "I had just joined the volunteer fire department." Ben immediately sat down on the grass. He knew a real story was beginning. Cedar Creek was much smaller back then. Samuel continued. There were no fancy fire engines, no modern equipment, just ordinary people, trying their best when someone needed help. One cold November night, the fire station bell rang just after midnight. A farmhouse outside town had caught fire. Samuel and the other volunteers raced through the darkness. The sky glowed orange long before they arrived. The flames were everywhere. Samuel whispered. The roof had already begun collapsing. Neighbors stood outside crying. Someone shouted, "There's still an old man inside!" Ben leaned forward. "Weren't you scared?" Samuel smiled honestly. "Terrified. Anyone who says firefighters aren't afraid has never walked into a burning house." The young volunteers searched room after room. Smoke filled every hallway. The heat made it difficult to breathe. Samuel remembered thinking he might not make it back outside. Then, near the back bedroom, he heard a faint cough. An elderly man lay trapped beneath a fallen beam. His white hair was covered in ash. His breathing was weak, but his eyes were calm, almost peaceful. Samuel and another firefighter lifted the heavy timber. Together, they carried the old man through the smoke. Moments after reaching the yard, part of the roof collapsed behind them. Ben's eyes widened. "You saved him." Samuel nodded slowly. For a little while, the old man survived the fire, but the smoke had badly damaged his lungs. The doctor quietly told the family he probably had only a few months left. Several weeks later, Samuel visited him at the small county hospital. The old man smiled the moment he walked in. "I've been waiting for you." Samuel laughed nervously. "I only did my job." The old man gently shook his head. "No. You gave me something more valuable than another day." Ben frowned. "What could be more valuable?" Samuel looked at the young oak beside them. "You'll understand." The old man introduced himself. My name is Walter Green. He spoke slowly. Every breath required effort. Yet, his eyes remained bright. During that visit, they talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about the fire. Not about dying. They talked about life. Gardens, family, rainstorms, oak trees. Samuel left. Walter asked him to wheel his chair beside the hospital window. Outside, a giant oak tree shaded the courtyard. Children played beneath its branches. Families shared lunches on wooden benches. Nurses often took their breaks there. Walter smiled. Beautiful tree. Samuel nodded. It really is. The old man gently rested one hand against the glass. My grandfather planted that tree. Samuel looked surprised. Really? Walter nodded. He planted it 60 years ago. Long before I was born. Samuel looked back toward the courtyard. Children laughed beneath the swaying branches. Birds nested high above. The tree seemed alive with purpose. Walter quietly whispered, I've never met the man who planted it. But every summer of my childhood, he protected me from the sun. Samuel didn't understand. Not yet. Walter looked toward him, then spoke the words that would quietly shape the rest of Samuel's life. The shade you enjoy today, he smiled gently, was planted by someone. He paused to catch his breath, who knew they would never sit beneath it. The hospital room became completely silent. Samuel looked once more at the great oak outside. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a tree. He was seeing an act of love, given decades earlier, to people the planter would never know. Walter continued softly. Most people spend their lives asking, what will I leave for my children? He smiled. I think the better question is, what will I leave for children I'll never meet? Samuel felt those words settle deep inside him, like seeds, waiting for the right season to grow. 3 months later, Walter Green passed away peacefully. His funeral was small, simple. After everyone else had gone home, Samuel remained beneath the old oak outside the church. The spring wind gently stirred its branches. He looked upward, then quietly made himself a promise. Every birthday, for as long as he lived, he would plant one oak tree, not in memory of Walter, not even for himself, but for someone he would never meet, someone who, many years from now, might sit beneath its shade. Without ever knowing his name, Samuel looked at Ben. The boy hadn't spoken for several minutes. His eyes remained fixed on the tiny sapling standing between them. It suddenly seemed much larger than before. Ben finally whispered, every tree is a gift. For a stranger. Samuel smiled warmly. Exactly. The old man gently patted the fresh soil around the young oak, then quietly added, and the beautiful thing about gifts like these, he looked toward the horizon, is that you never need to be around to watch someone open them. The little oak tree stood quietly in the fresh spring sunlight. Its slender branches swayed gently in the breeze. Ben looked at it differently now. It was no longer just another tree. It was a promise, as they packed the shovels back into Samuel's old pickup. Ben couldn't stop thinking about Walter Green, about the giant oak outside the hospital, about one man planting a tree for people he would never meet. Samuel climbed into the driver's seat. Would you like to see something? Ben nodded immediately. I'd love to. A few minutes later, the truck rolled into Samuel's gravel driveway. The white farmhouse looked peaceful beneath the morning sky. Bluebirds fluttered between the flower beds. Wind chimes gently danced beneath the porch roof. Everything about the place felt calm, as though time moved more slowly there. Inside the workshop, the scent of cedar wood and fresh soil filled the air. Garden tools hung neatly on the wall. Clay pots lined long wooden shelves. Dozens of seed packets were arranged in small glass jars. Everything had its place. Samuel walked toward an old oak bookshelf in the corner. 46 notebooks rested there, every one carefully labeled by year. Ben stared in amazement. You've really kept them all, Samuel smiled. I promised myself I wouldn't forget. He carefully removed the oldest notebook. Its brown leather cover had faded with time. The corners were worn smooth. He opened it slowly. The first page read April 12, 1980, Oak Tree Phi 1, location Riverside Park, height 18 inches, weather cool morning after light rain. Ben smiled. It looks like a journal. Samuel nodded. in a way. It is. He turned to the final page. Only one sentence had been written, in neat handwriting, for whoever needs a quiet place to read after a difficult day. Ben looked confused. You wrote that before anyone ever sat there. Samuel nodded. I hoped someone would. He reached for another notebook, 1986 Oak Tree, Phase 7, at the bottom of the page. Another message, for whoever teaches a child how to ride a bicycle beneath these branches. Another notebook, 1993, for whoever falls in love while walking this trail. Another, 2001, for the tired nurse who needs 10 peaceful minutes before going home. Another, 2008, for the grandfather who someday tells stories in this shade. Ben's eyes grew wider with every page. You imagined all these people. Samuel smiled. No, I believed they would exist. He gently closed the notebook. When you plant something, you're planting hope, and hope always belongs to the future. Ben slowly walked toward the window. Outside, he could see one of Samuel's earliest oak trees. Its massive branches stretched across the edge of the property. Several robins had built a nest near the top. 2 squirrels chased each other along the limbs. A young mother pushed a stroller beneath the shade. Without realizing it, she stopped there for a few minutes, simply enjoying the cool afternoon breeze. Samuel quietly smiled. I've never met her. Ben looked outside. No, but she's using your gift. Just then, someone knocked gently on the workshop door. Mrs. Evelyn Parker stepped inside carrying a basket of warm cornbread. I baked too much again. She laughed. That's never happened, Samuel teased. She noticed the notebook spread across the table. I've lived next door for 30 years, she said quietly. I never knew you kept records. Samuel shrugged. They weren't meant to be hidden, I guess. No one ever asked. Ben looked at Mrs. Parker excitedly. Every tree has a message. She smiled. A message. Samuel handed her one of the notebooks. She adjusted her glasses, then read aloud. For whoever brings their first grandchild to feed the birds here. Mrs. Parker stopped reading. Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, I did. Samuel looked puzzled. What do you mean? She smiled through tears. 5 years ago, I brought little Emily to Oak Hill Park. She fed the ducks all afternoon. Oh, she laughed softly. It was the happiest day I'd had since my husband passed away. Samuel looked at the notebook again. He had written those words, nearly 20 years before, never knowing, one day, his own neighbor would unknowingly become the person he had imagined. Mrs. Parker gently closed the notebook. You wrote this for me. Samuel shook his head kindly. I wrote it. For whoever needed that day. She smiled. It turns out, that was me. The room fell silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, the kind that arrives when everyone realizes something beautiful has been happening, without anyone noticing. That afternoon, Ben helped Samuel return the notebooks to the shelf. Before closing the last one, he noticed several blank pages at the back. Why did you leave these empty? Samuel smiled. Because I knew there were still trees waiting to be planted. Ben thought quietly for a moment, then looked up. Can I start doing this too? Samuel's eyes softened. The notebooks. Ben nodded. And the trees. Samuel walked over to an old wooden cabinet. He opened the bottom drawer. Inside were several brand new leather journals, untouched. He picked one up, brushed away a thin layer of dust, then placed it gently into Ben's hands. I bought these years ago. He smiled. I was hoping someone would ask. Ben carefully opened the blank notebook. On the inside cover, Samuel had already written one sentence. The best time to plant hope is today. Ben looked at the empty pages ahead of him. For the first time, he understood. A notebook didn't begin with writing. It began with believing there would be a tomorrow worth preparing for. As the afternoon sun filtered through the workshop window, 2 generations stood quietly beside a shelf filled with 46 notebooks. One man had spent a lifetime planting trees. The other had just planted his first dream. Spring slowly gave way to summer. Ben planted his first oak tree beside the old walking trail just outside Cedar Creek. It wasn't large, barely taller than his shoulder, but to him, it already felt important. Samuel stood a few steps away, watching quietly. He didn't tell Ben where to dig, or how deep. He simply let the boy learn. When Ben finally finished covering the roots with soil, Samuel asked, "Did you bring your notebook?" The Ben grinned. He pulled the small leather journal from his backpack, carefully opened the first page, then wrote June. 3 Oak Tree Fay 1 location. East walking trail height 22 inches. After a long moment of thinking, he added one final sentence. For whoever needs to believe tomorrow can be better than today. Samuel read it, then smiled proudly. I think Walter Green would have liked that. The weeks passed. Ben visited his little tree almost every afternoon. He watered it, pulled weeds around its roots. Sometimes, he simply sat beside it, talking about school, his parents, his dreams, as if the tiny oak were already an old friend. Children notice things adults often overlook. Soon, Ben's classmates became curious. What are you doing out here every day? Ben told them Samuel's story, about Walter, about the oak outside the hospital, about planting gifts for strangers. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Before long, 3 more children asked Samuel if they could plant trees too. Then 6, then 12. Every Saturday morning, the old pickup truck carried more shovels than before. Laughter replaced silence. Tiny hands pressed fresh soil around young roots. Parents stood nearby taking photographs. Samuel rarely spoke during those mornings. He simply watched. His quiet promise was beginning to belong to others. Mrs. Evelyn Parker laughed one afternoon. Sam, you've started a gardening club. Samuel shook his head. No. He looked at the children. They're starting something much bigger. By late August, nearly 30 new oak saplings had been planted around Cedar Creek, along school paths, near playgrounds, beside the public library, around the nursing home. Each tree carried a small wooden marker, not with the name of the person who planted it, but with a simple message, for someone you'll never meet. People began stopping to read them. Some smiled. Some quietly wiped away tears. Others stood silently, thinking about people they would never know. Then, September arrived, and with it, the weather changed. Dark clouds gathered more often. The wind became restless. The local news warned of the strongest storm the county had seen in decades. Most residents weren't overly concerned. Storms came every year. This one, they assumed, would pass like all the others. But 3 days later, the rain began. It did not stop, for hours, then for an entire day. The small river beside Cedar Creek rose higher and higher. Roads disappeared beneath muddy water. Tree branches snapped beneath powerful winds. Emergency crews worked through the night. Samuel stood quietly on his porch, watching the rain. Ben and his parents arrived just before sunset. Should we leave? Ben asked nervously. Samuel looked toward the hills. Not yet. Around midnight, the emergency sirens echoed across town. Residents living near the river were ordered to evacuate. Families hurried into their cars. Neighbors helped elderly couples carry belongings. Children clutched blankets and stuffed animals. The storm seemed endless. The next morning, everyone expected the worst. People feared homes would be destroyed, fields washed away, roads buried beneath mud. When daylight finally returned, the town gathered outside. Slowly, carefully, they began driving through Cedar Creek. What they found made no sense. Some nearby towns had suffered terrible flooding. Entire hillsides had collapsed. Several roads had disappeared. Yet Cedar Creek, though certainly damaged, had survived far better than anyone expected. Mayor Helen Carter stared toward the western edge of town. Something unusual caught her attention. The steep hillside above Cedar Creek remained almost completely intact. No major landslide, very little erosion. County engineers arrived later that afternoon. They walked through the woods, studying the ground, examining roots, measuring water flow. Finally, one of them gathered the townspeople together. I think we know why your town survived. Everyone waited. The engineer pointed toward the broad hillside, covered with hundreds of mature oak trees. The roots, he said simply. He explained that over decades, the massive network of oak roots had locked the soil together. The trees slowed rushing water, absorbed enormous amounts of rainfall, prevented the hillside from collapsing. Without them, much of Cedar Creek would likely have been buried beneath mud and floodwater. Silence spread through the crowd. People slowly looked at one another. Then, almost at the same time, their eyes turned toward Samuel. The old man stood quietly near the back, hat in his hands, saying nothing. Ben looked up at him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your trees. They saved the town." Samuel gently shook his head. "Our trees." The mayor walked toward him. "Sam, did you know this could happen?" Samuel smiled softly. "I knew healthy forests protect the land." He looked across the hillside. "I just never imagined they'd be needed this soon." Parker began to cry. "My house. It should have been flooded." The engineer nodded. "It probably would have been, if those trees hadn't been here." For decades, people believed Samuel had been planting trees because he loved nature. Now, for the first time, they understood. He had quietly been protecting neighbors who didn't even know they needed protecting. That evening, as the clouds finally parted, golden sunlight broke through the sky. Its warm light filtered through thousands of oak leaves. The entire hillside shimmered. Ben stood beside Samuel, looking at the forest stretching into the distance. "So," he whispered, "people were already opening your gifts, before they even knew they had received them." Samuel smiled. His eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "That's usually how the best gifts work." The storm was over. The floodwaters slowly receded. Sunlight returned to Cedar Creek. For the first time in days, people stepped outside without fear. There were broken fences, damaged roofs, mud-covered roads. There was also something unexpected: gratitude. Neighbors helped one another clear fallen branches. Teenagers carried supplies to elderly residents. Children gathered scattered flower pots from front yards. No one waited to be asked. The town simply came together. 3 mornings later, Mayor Helen Carter called for a community meeting in the old town hall. Every seat was filled. Farmers, teachers, shop owners, retired couples, young families, even high school students stood along the back wall. Everyone wanted to understand how one man's quiet habit had protected an entire town. Samuel almost didn't attend. He disliked being the center of attention. But Ben convinced him. "They're not coming to celebrate you. They're coming to learn." Samuel smiled. "There is a difference." The mayor stepped onto the stage. Behind her hung a large aerial photograph of Cedar Creek, taken only 2 days after the storm. The forest Samuel had planted over 4 decades stretched like a green ribbon across the western hills. "Our engineers completed their report yesterday," she began. "They estimate these oak trees reduced soil erosion by more than half." She paused, "and likely prevented millions of dollars in damage." The room remained silent. No one applauded. Somehow, numbers felt too small for what everyone was feeling. Instead, the mayor invited anyone who wished to speak. For a moment, no one moved. Then an elderly woman slowly stood. It was Mrs. Margaret Lewis. At 88, she had lived in Cedar Creek longer than almost anyone. She looked toward Samuel. "I don't know if you remember this," she said softly. 40 years ago, my husband asked me to marry him beneath one of your oak trees." A gentle laugh spread through the room. She smiled through tears. "We celebrated our 50th anniversary there, too." She sat down. Then another man stood. Coach David Miller, retired high school baseball coach. "When our team lost the state championship, though," he said, "I gathered the boys under one of those trees. We talked for hours. They learned losing with dignity." He looked at Samuel. "I guess your trees have been coaching too." Laughter filled the hall. A young mother rose next. "Emily Harper, my daughter took her first steps under the tree beside the library. I still have the photograph." She held up her phone. The screen showed a tiny toddler laughing beneath a broad canopy of green leaves. Then came a quiet voice from the back. "Dr. Susan Reynolds, the town physician. There were days," she admitted, "when I thought I couldn't continue. After losing patience, I would eat lunch alone beneath the oak near the clinic." She smiled gently. It reminded me to breathe. To one by one, the stories continued. A veteran who found peace after sleepless nights. A widower who learned to smile again while feeding birds beneath a shaded bench. A little girl who learned to read under a spreading branch every summer afternoon. a young musician who wrote his first song sitting against one of Samuel's trees. A family who held a picnic every Father's Day beneath the same oak for 25 years. As each person spoke, Ben began noticing something extraordinary. Every important memory, every story of comfort, hope, love, healing, somehow led back to one of Samuel's trees. He leaned toward Samuel. "You didn't just plant trees." Samuel looked puzzled. Ben smiled. "You planted places where life happened." Samuel lowered his eyes. For several seconds, he couldn't speak, not because he was proud, because he had never imagined. The trees had become part of so many lives. After the final speaker sat down, Mayor Carter carried a large rolled-up map onto the stage. She carefully spread it across a table. It showed the entire town. Hundreds of small green circles covered the map. Each marked the location of one of Samuel's oaks. "We've been researching," she explained. 6 trees, across parks, schools, walking trails, the nursing home, the church, the library. They've quietly become the heart of Cedar Creek. She handed Samuel a small wooden box. Inside was a brass compass, old-fashioned, beautifully engraved. On the back, the townspeople had written, "You always helped us find our way." Samuel gently closed the lid. His hands trembled slightly. "I don't deserve this." Mrs. Parker smiled. "You're right." Everyone looked at her. She laughed softly. "You don't deserve a compass. You deserve a forest." The room erupted in warm laughter and applause. When the applause finally faded, Samuel slowly stood. He looked around the hall, at faces he had known for decades. Children, parents, grandparents, friends. Then he quietly spoke. "I never planted trees, so people would remember me." He paused. "I planted them, so someday people might forget that there was ever a time without shade." The room fell silent. Those words settled gently into every heart. Ben wrote them carefully inside his notebook, underneath his first entry. He knew, one day, he would read them again, perhaps to his own grandchildren. As everyone left the meeting, children ran outside to play beneath the old oaks. Parents watched from nearby benches. The afternoon breeze rustled thousands of green leaves overhead. Samuel stood at the doorway, watching quietly. For the first time, he realized his greatest accomplishment wasn't the forest. It was the countless ordinary moments the forest had made possible. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Samuel opened his newest notebook. He added one more sentence beneath the previous entry. "For whoever discovers that the greatest legacy is creating a place where others can make their own memories." He closed the journal, smiled softly, and placed it beside the other 45. Summer slowly faded into autumn. The leaves of Cedar Creek's oak trees turned shades of gold, amber, and deep crimson. The forest Samuel had planted over 46 years had never looked more beautiful. Every morning, Samuel still walked through his garden. He still watered the roses, still greeted the birds as if they were old friends. But Ben noticed something different. The walks had become shorter. The pauses had become longer. Sometimes, Samuel rested one hand against a fence post before taking another step. One afternoon, as they sat beneath the oldest oak in Riverside Park, Ben asked quietly, "Are you feeling all right?" Samuel smiled. "I've had 85 wonderful years. My body is simply reminding me of that." Ben forced a smile, but inside, his heart grew heavy. For the first time, he realized, even people who seemed as steady as oak trees could grow tired. A week later, Samuel missed the Saturday tree planting. It had never happened before. Mrs. Parker brought him homemade soup. Dr. Susan Reynolds stopped by after work. The doctor smiled reassuringly. "Nothing serious, but your heart needs more rest. No heavy digging for a while." Samuel chuckled. "I suppose my shovel has finally started complaining." The doctor looked at him kindly. "No, Sam, your friends are." The news traveled quickly through Cedar Creek. By the next morning, people began leaving small gifts on Samuel's porch. Fresh vegetables, warm bread, homemade pies, handwritten notes, bouquets of wildflowers picked by children. No one rang the bell. They simply left their gifts and quietly walked away. Ben visited every afternoon after school. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. They would simply sit together, watching sunlight dance through the leaves. Neither of them felt the need to fill every silence. One evening, Samuel looked toward the large oak standing beside his porch. "I planted that one. The year your mother was born." Ben smiled. "It's enormous." Samuel nodded. "It grew while life was happening." Ben looked up into the branches. "I wish trees could talk." Samuel laughed softly. "They do. We just don't always know how to listen." October arrived. Samuel's 86th birthday was only 3 weeks away. Normally, he would already be searching for the perfect young oak. Instead, his shovel leaned untouched against the workshop wall. Late one afternoon, Ben quietly entered the workshop. The shelf of notebooks caught his attention. 46 journals, 46 birthdays, 46 promises. He suddenly imagined the shelf ending there. No 47th notebook. No 47th tree. The thought made his chest ache. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Walter Green's words. "The shade you enjoy today." He sat up in bed, then suddenly smiled. Maybe Samuel didn't need to dig another hole. Maybe someone else could. The next morning, Ben rode his bicycle straight to Mayor Helen Carter's office. "I need your help," he said before she could even say good morning. Within an hour, the mayor called Mrs. Parker. Mrs. Parker called Coach Miller. Coach Miller called the fire department. The fire department called the high school principal. By sunset, nearly the entire town knew the plan. Everyone, except Samuel. For the next 2 weeks, the people of Cedar Creek worked quietly. The local nursery donated dozens of oak saplings. Carpenters built simple wooden tree markers. Students painted them by hand. Families volunteered tools. Retirees prepared lunches for the volunteers. Nobody asked for recognition. Everyone simply wanted to continue what Samuel had started. Meanwhile, Samuel noticed unusual activity around town. People smiled whenever they saw him, then quickly changed the subject. Mrs. Parker seemed unable to hide her excitement. Ben became mysteriously busy every afternoon. Samuel laughed one evening. "I believe this town is keeping a secret from me." A Mrs. pretended to look surprised. We're terrible at secrets." Samuel smiled. "Exactly." Finally, his birthday arrived. The morning was bright. Cool. Perfect for planting. Samuel reached for his old shovel out of habit, then remembered the doctor's instructions. He quietly placed it back against the wall. For the first time in 46 years, he whispered, "I suppose this year, there won't be a tree." Just then, a knock sounded at the front door. Ben stood outside, wearing his nicest shirt. Behind him, the street was empty. Or so it seemed. "Would you come with me?" Ben asked. Samuel smiled. "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise." Curious, Samuel climbed into the old pickup. Ben drove. The short journey felt strangely familiar, but instead of heading toward an empty field, they arrived at the large meadow overlooking Cedar Creek. Samuel stepped out slowly, then stopped. His eyes widened. Across the hillside, hundreds of people stood waiting. Children, parents, teachers, firefighters, nurses, farmers, veterans. Every family in town seemed to be there. Each person held a young oak sapling. A gentle breeze moved through the meadow. Tiny green leaves fluttered in the morning light. The hillside looked like a sea of hope, waiting to be planted. Mayor Carter stepped forward. She smiled warmly. "Sam, you once told us, the greatest gifts are the ones we leave for strangers." She looked around at the crowd. "Today, would like to leave one with you." Ben handed Samuel a brand new leather notebook. Its cover was still blank. Inside, the first page had already been written, not by Samuel, but by every child in Cedar Creek. Together, it read, "Tree Fay 47 planted by an entire town. Because one man taught us that the future belongs to everyone." Samuel's hands trembled. He gently touched the page, unable to speak. Mayor Carter smiled. "You don't have to dig today," as she looked toward the crowd. "We'll do the digging, one by one." Families spread across the hillside. Shovels entered the earth. Children laughed. Parents knelt beside them. Grandparents held tiny saplings steady. Samuel watched in silence as hundreds of people planted oak trees together, not because they had been told to, but because one quiet man had spent 46 6 birthdays showing them how. A tear slowly rolled down Samuel's cheek. Mrs. Parker gently squeezed his hand. You see, Sam, she whispered, you were never growing a forest. She looked across the hillside covered with families. You were growing gardeners. Samuel smiled through his tears. For the first time, he understood. The greatest proof that a legacy lives on is the moment it no longer depends on the person who began it. The morning after Samuel's birthday, Cedar Creek looked different, not because the town had changed overnight, but because the hillsides now held hundreds of tiny oak saplings. Each one represented a promise from one family to another family they would never know. Children returned after school to check on their trees. Parents carried buckets of water. Grandparents brought folding chairs and watched with quiet smiles. For the first time, tree planting wasn't a project. It had become a tradition. Samuel visited the hillside every few days. He no longer carried a shovel, only a walking stick and his old straw hat. He moved more slowly now, but every step seemed filled with gratitude. One afternoon, Ben noticed Samuel stopping beside each young tree, not to inspect it, but to gently touch one leaf, almost as though he were greeting an old friend. What are you doing? Ben asked. Samuel smiled. I'm introducing myself. Ben laughed. They're trees. Samuel nodded. Yes, but someday, they'll introduce themselves to someone else. A week later, a short article appeared in the county newspaper. The headline read, A man 5-year-old Amatar Evir IBRTH Day YFR 46-year has Jade Olududi IN ed aim. The story was simple, no dramatic language, just photographs. Samuel standing quietly beside Ben. Families planting together, children carrying tiny saplings twice their size. No one expected what happened next. Within days, the article spread across social media. Then television stations picked it up. Then national newspapers. People from every corner of the country began sharing the story, not because it was about trees, because it reminded them that one person's quiet kindness could outlive an entire lifetime. Letters started arriving. First 5, then 20, then hundreds. The old mailbox outside Samuel's farmhouse overflowed every afternoon. Mrs. Parker finally brought over a second mailbox. We're going to need this, she laughed. Some letters came from schoolchildren, others from retired teachers, military veterans, doctors, construction workers, young parents, widows, college students. Every letter carried the same message in different words. Thank you. One envelope came from Arizona. Inside, a photograph. It showed 3 generations of one family standing beside a newly planted oak. On the back, someone had written, "We planted this because of you." Another arrived from Maine. A retired couple wrote, "We don't have grandchildren, but someday, someone else's grandchildren will play beneath this tree." Samuel quietly folded the letter. His eyes glistened. Ben helped organize every letter into boxes. Soon there were so many, they had to label them by state. California, Texas, Ohio, Oregon, New York. One shelf in the workshop slowly filled with stories from strangers. Then one Tuesday morning, a television van pulled into Cedar Creek. A national news network wanted to interview Samuel. The mayor asked if he felt comfortable. Samuel chuckled. I've spent my whole life avoiding attention. He looked toward Ben. Maybe this isn't attention. Maybe it's another seed. The interview took place beneath the largest oak in Riverside Park, the same tree Samuel had planted more than 40 years earlier. Families quietly watched from a distance. Children played nearby. Birds sang overhead. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. The reporter smiled warmly. "Mr. You've become an inspiration to millions." Samuel looked genuinely puzzled. "I have." The reporter laughed. "I believe so." She asked about Walter Green, about the notebooks, about the storm, about the birthday celebration. Samuel answered every question simply, never making himself the hero, always talking about the next generation. Finally, the reporter asked one last question. If you could ask every person watching today to remember just one thing, what would it be? Samuel looked up into the branches above him. Sunlight shimmered through thousands of green leaves. Children laughed nearby. A young father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders. An elderly couple shared a picnic beneath the shade. He smiled softly, then answered, "I think we spend too much time asking, what can I accomplish before I'm gone?" He paused. "I prefer another question." The park became completely silent. Even the reporter lowered her microphone. Samuel continued, "What can I begin?" He looked toward Ben. "That won't need me to finish it." No one spoke. The wind gently moved through the oak leaves. Samuel smiled again. "A tree. A kindness. A friendship. A scholarship. A tradition. They all grow the same way." He gently pointed toward the ground. "Someone simply has to plant the first seed." The interview aired that Sunday evening. Millions of people watched. Across the country, communities began organizing tree planting days. Schools started future forest programs. Churches planted memorial groves. Veterans groups dedicated trees to fallen friends. Neighborhood associations transformed empty lots into parks. None of them copied Samuel exactly. Each community created its own tradition. And Samuel loved that. When Ben showed him newspaper headlines from around the country, Samuel smiled. "They've improved the idea," he said. "That's exactly what they're supposed to do." A month later, the governor invited Samuel to receive a state award for community service. Samuel politely declined. Instead, he wrote a short letter. "Please plant the money you would spend honoring me. Buy young trees for schools instead." The governor did exactly that. More than 500 oak saplings were delivered to public schools across the state. Each one came with a small plaque that read, "The future grows from ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary love." That evening, Samuel and Ben walked slowly through Cedar Creek. They passed children watering young trees, teenagers repairing wooden markers, neighbors helping one another without being asked. Ben smiled. "I think you've changed the country." Samuel gently shook his head. "No." He looked around the peaceful town. "I simply reminded people of something they already knew." Winter arrived gently. The first frost covered Cedar Creek like a thin blanket of silver. The oak trees Samuel had planted stood bare now. Their leaves had fallen. Their branches reached quietly toward the pale morning sky. To some, they looked lifeless. Samuel knew better. "They're resting," he often said, "not ending." Although the cold had settled in, people still visited the young saplings planted during Samuel's birthday celebration. Children wrapped burlap around the delicate trunks. Parents spread fresh mulch around the roots. Teenagers built small wooden fences to protect them from deer. No one had to remind them. The trees already belonged to everyone. Samuel rarely left the farmhouse now. His legs tired easily. Even short walks required his cane. But every afternoon, he sat on the front porch, watching birds gather beneath the old oak beside the house. Sometimes, Ben joined him after school. Neither of them minded the silence. One December afternoon, Samuel looked toward the great tree. "I've been thinking." Ben smiled. "You always are." Samuel chuckled. "I don't think I'll be here when these new trees become giants." Ben lowered his eyes. He didn't want to hear those words. Samuel gently touched the boy's shoulder. "Ben, don't be sad because a gardener grows old." He smiled. "Be grateful that the garden doesn't." A few days before Christmas, Samuel asked Mayor Helen Carter for one small favor. "I'd like to gather the children, just once, beneath the oldest oak in town." The mayor didn't ask why. She simply made a few phone calls. On the following Saturday afternoon, families quietly gathered in Riverside Park. Snow rested lightly across the grass. The enormous oak stood proudly in the center of the park. Its thick trunk had witnessed more than 4 decades of laughter. Birthdays, picnics, first kisses, goodbyes, and second chances. Samuel arrived slowly, supported by Ben on one side and Mrs. Parker on the other. As the children saw him, they rushed forward, not to speak, but to help. One little girl carried his folding chair. A boy no older than 8 held his walking stick. Another child brushed snow from the bench beneath the tree. Samuel smiled. The future is in good hands. When everyone had settled, he looked around the circle. More than 80 children sat quietly before him. Parents stood behind them. No microphones. No television cameras, just neighbors. Samuel reached into his coat pocket. He removed a small acorn, then held it up. The children leaned closer. "This," he said softly, "looks very ordinary. It fits in the palm of your hand." He smiled, hidden inside. "I's a forest." He passed the acorn to the first child. Each youngster held it for only a moment before carefully passing it to the next. By the time it returned to Samuel, every child had touched it. He looked at them kindly. People are like this too. Inside every person, there is more kindness, more courage, and more love. Then they realize. A little boy raised his hand. "How do we know?" Samuel smiled. "Because someone once believed it was there." The children nodded quietly. Even many of the adults wiped away tears. Samuel reached into a small canvas bag beside his chair. Inside were dozens of tiny envelopes, one for every child. Ben helped hand them out. Each envelope contained one acorn and a folded piece of paper. The children opened them together. Inside each note, Samuel had written the same message. "Someday, when you believe the world needs more kindness, don't wait for someone else. Plant something, build something, help someone, begin." The words settled gently over the crowd. No applause followed, only silence, the kind of silence that changes people. Samuel looked toward Ben, then toward all the children. "I've spent 46 birthdays planting trees." He smiled. Trees were never the point. The children listened carefully. "The point," he continued, "was believing that tomorrow deserves our best effort, even if we never see tomorrow ourselves." Ben quietly opened his notebook. He wrote every word. He knew. Years from now, these sentences would matter even more. As the afternoon sun began to sink, Samuel slowly stood. With Ben's help, he walked to the base of the great oak. He rested one hand against its rough bark, closed his eyes. For several moments, no one spoke. The winter wind moved gently through the bare branches above. Finally, Samuel turned back toward the children. "There is one promise I'd like you all to make." Dozens of young faces looked up at him. "If someday you become successful, don't ask, 'What do I deserve?'" He smiled warmly. "Ask instead, 'Who can enjoy the shade because I was here?'" No one forgot those words. Not that day. Not ever. Before everyone left, the children gathered around the old oak. Together, without anyone suggesting it, they placed their hands against the great trunk. Small hands, large hands, old hands, 4 generations, touching the same tree, a living reminder that no life grows alone. As dusk settled over Cedar Creek, snowflakes began drifting quietly from the sky. Samuel looked upward. A peaceful smile crossed his face. The old oak stood silently behind him, strong, steady, its roots hidden beneath the earth, its branches reaching toward the future, much like the man who had planted it. Winter came and went. Then spring returned once again. The oak trees across Cedar Creek awakened with fresh, green leaves. The youngest saplings stretched a little higher toward the morning sun. The oldest giants stood as faithfully as ever, their roots unseen, their purpose unmistakable. On a quiet April morning, church bells echoed across town. Neighbors gathered without invitations. No announcements had been made. No reminders had been sent. Everyone simply knew. It was Samuel Brooks' birthday. For the first time in 47 years, Samuel was not there to place a young oak into the earth. Just 3 months earlier, he had passed away peacefully in his sleep, 86 years old. His final evening had been exactly as he loved it, watching the sunset from his porch, a notebook resting beside him, a cup of warm tea in his hands. Mrs. Parker later said. He smiled as though he could already see tomorrow. His funeral had been simple, just as he had requested. No expensive flowers, no grand speeches. Instead, every family brought a single acorn. They placed them together in a wooden bowl beside his photograph. By the end of the service, the bowl overflowed, not with grief, but with beginnings. Samuel had left one final letter, addressed not to a person, but to the people of Cedar Creek. Mayor Helen Carter unfolded the letter beneath the oldest oak in Riverside Park. Her voice trembled gently as she began to read. My dear friends, if you are hearing these words, then my hands have finally planted their last tree. Please don't be sad. No gardener expects to stay forever. We simply hope the garden will. Many people quietly wiped away tears. Children held their parents' hands. The breeze carried the sound of rustling branches overhead, almost as if the old oaks themselves were listening. The mayor continued, "If you wish to remember me, don't build a statue. Don't name a street after me. Don't spend money on monuments. Find a place where someone might someday need hope, and plant something there." Silence settled over the park. No one moved. No one spoke. Then came the final lines. The words Samuel had written only days before his passing. "The world has enough famous people. What it needs is more quiet gardeners." The letter ended simply. "Thank you for helping me grow a forest I could never have planted alone." Mayor Carter folded the paper carefully. She looked across the crowd. "I think," she whispered. "He already knows." And Ben stepped forward. He was older now. 20 years had passed. The curious 10-year-old boy had become a teacher. On the first day of every school year, he told his students the story of Walter Green, the hospital oak, and the man who planted birthdays instead of buying presents. Beside him stood a little girl with bright, curious eyes. His 8-year-old daughter, Emily. She tugged gently on his sleeve. "Is today tree day?" Ben smiled. "It is." She looked toward the long line of families carrying young saplings. "Can I plant one too?" Ben knelt beside her. "Do you remember why we plant them?" Emily nodded proudly. "For people we'll never meet." Ben smiled. Together, father and daughter walked toward an open meadow. Hundreds of neighbors followed. Some carried oak saplings. Others carried maple, dogwood, and pine. Samuel had inspired them with oaks, but he had never insisted the future look exactly like his own dream. The important thing was to plant hope. Emily carefully lowered a tiny oak into the earth. Ben helped cover the roots. She reached into her small backpack, pulled out a notebook, brand new, brown leather, just like Samuel's. She wrote slowly, "Oak tree Fay 1," then paused, thinking carefully. Finally she smiled, and wrote, "For whoever someday needs a reason to believe that kindness keeps growing." Ben read the sentence. He looked toward the hillside, toward the hundreds of mature oaks Samuel had planted, toward the hundreds more planted by the town, toward the children laughing as they watered young trees. At that moment, he realized something. Samuel had never really planted 46 trees. He had planted thousands, not with his own hands, but through the hands of others. Years continued to pass. The birthday tree tradition spread to neighboring towns, then neighboring counties. Schools celebrated it every spring. Retirement communities planted remembrance gardens. Newly married couples planted future trees. Families welcomed newborn babies by placing a young sapling into the ground. One quiet promise had become a way of life. Near the entrance to Riverside Park, visitors often stopped to read a small wooden sign. It did not list Samuel's achievements. It did not mention awards. It simply read, "Samuel Brooks, 1939-2026. He believed every generation should leave more shade than it received." Tourists sometimes ask, who was Samuel Brooks? The people of Cedar Creek usually smiled, then pointed toward the forest. "You'll understand. Take a walk." One warm summer afternoon, Emily sat beneath a towering oak, reading a book. A young boy she had never met wandered over. "Do you know who planted this tree?" he asked. Emily looked up through the green branches. Sunlight danced between thousands of leaves. She smiled. "Yes." She gently closed her book. It started with one grandfather who believed the future was worth loving. Afar above them, the leaves whispered softly in the summer wind, just as they had for generations. And somewhere within that quiet forest, Samuel's greatest dream continued to grow. Not because people remembered his name, but because they remembered to plant something whose shade they would never live long enough to enjoy.